This is the Middle-earth philosopher. Nerdanel is a character that I've long wanted to get insight into since I first read the Silmarillion and read about her history with her husband, Feanor. We all know who he is, and rightfully so. However, Nerdanel barely gets mentioned at all, yet at the same time, what is said about her is profoundly important as well. Quote, Nerdanel also was firm of will, but more patient than Feanor, desiring to understand minds rather than to master them. And at first, she restrained him when the fire of his heart grew too hot. But his later deeds grieved her, and they became estranged. End quote. So, who the hell was this person that could control someone like Feanor? Someone so hot-tempered, so independent, and so mad and loaded with issues that not even the Valar themselves could control him. What was her part in the story of Feanor and vice versa? Because they both served the larger story of the Noldor in the First Age. And yet, I have had a hard-ass time trying to track down solid information regarding her, at least canon-wise, to get what her point of view and perspective was on the events that unfolded in Valinor and the rest of the First Age. So, be warned, there's going to be some speculation in here, but I'm going to try to draw what little information I found from the Silmarillion, Morgoth's Ring, and the peoples of Middle-earth. Nerdanel's outlook seems to be very similar to early Feanor. Both were explorers, hungry to know new things and create new things, and that's how she initially first met him, spending much time exploring the rest of Aman and the Holy West during its most peaceful era when Melkor was still imprisoned. And though by this time Feanor had quite the reputation among the Noldor as being an arrogant asshole, I think Nerdanel believed that he was essentially a good elf, that he was trying to do good things and did do good things in his creations and whatnot, but was just largely misunderstood, and that, yes, he was ambitious, but so were the rest of the Noldor. Positive aspects that I think the rest of the Noldor, the Valar, and arguably many fans did not see at all. This level of empathy and their shared adventures together does eventually lead to them falling in love and eventually getting married. That Nerdanel was as strong-willed as her husband is almost a dead given, because she would have to be married to someone like Feanor. And just as Feanor was perceptive into the motive of others when his emotions were controlled, so was Nerdanel's, only she's noted as being much more calm and specializing in empathy, something Feanor clearly lacked and that the two did not share. What they did share, though, was that a sense of independence and extreme creativity. Nerdanel being a sculptor of some renown, apparently as her family served and were taught by the Vala Aule. It's easy to see her as being kind of rustic and rough and tumble in her youth, kind of an elf tomboy, I guess you could say. Not something fans would equate with a high elf of Valinor, and I think more so of a dark elf. And I believe that's why she's noted as being not the fairest of the elves of Valinor. She was not, per se, someone like Galadriel, who was noted for her beauty, and probably the only elf woman who was close to her in terms of spirit would have been Aradhel, daughter of Thingolfin, who has also noted for being much more physically active than many other elf women. Moreover, Nerdanel strikes me as the type of person who wouldn't care that she wasn't the prettiest, basically. In fact, she probably wasn't around other elves long enough to hear the gossip, since she's either hiking, carving, or learning, or spending time with Feanor. Nerdanel was an active woman, like most Noldor in general. And since Feanor was already known for these traits as well, it drew him to her, and I think that's why he fell for her, and vice versa. Kind of the bad boy falls for the bad girl, I guess you can say. I think for Feanor, he saw her as different, and yeah, that's a cliche, but it absolutely applies here. Nerdanel was just as restless as Feanor, and could engage his mind and his internal fire without judging him or being in conflict with him as well. And, as the quote says, in fact, actually tempered when he got too intense, because that was also part of his nature, hence his name. And in this way, they served to perfectly complement each other as well. Feanor wasn't completely far gone as he later becomes, but any negative traits that he did have, Nerdanel, for a long time apparently, served to keep that under control, while at the same time both of them provided each other company and a sense of equality that they both didn't feel isolated, I guess you can say. And again, not to pin Nerdanel to only the role of supporting her husband, but it is very important that she's the only person who can control essentially who is the most powerful elf to have ever existed. And I think that this served to temper her own fire so that it didn't drive her as well to be consumed. And patience is an important quality in smith work, which is what her family did. And her family was convinced, I guess, that Feanor had positive qualities enough that he was accepted and was taught further by them other than what he was naturally gifted at. So, researching this, I've read that many fans interpreted this as being a very fiery and passionate romance based off her unpublished character notes alone, which I'm kind of inclined to agree with now. I mean, 7 kids? I mean, come on. Apparently, high elves only have about 4 kids in the norm, so, they were getting busy, I guess. But that Nerdanel saw Feanor as kind of a diamond in the rough who could be tempered and molded into a powerful tool to create wondrous things, which he did. Yes, Feanor could be hard to deal with, egotistical, and clearly had issues, but he was also driven to learn past the norm of what many other elves just accepted and create things that other elves pretty much slept on, i.e. the Cimmerals. And there was no doubt that Feanor was a prodigy with the potential to be the greatest elf Feanor had ever seen, and the two of them together being arguably the most powerful couple that Feanor had ever seen, creating a powerful lineage that could be the envy of all the Eldar, just like what her father-in-law, High King Finwë, wanted with his first wife, Miriel, Feanor's mother. Sounds like the dream, right? How could anything go wrong? Which, of course, it did. So the question then becomes, what went wrong? How did things go from this ideal state of the perfect marriage with the perfect family in the perfect world to being one of the only 2 survivors of Feanor's line left at the end of the First Age? Now, blaming Melkor would be easy, and for certain he played a massive part in corrupting Feanor and by killing his father as well. But Melkor was simply the match. Remember, nuance. The issue, I believe, primarily stems from the issue of parentage between the two. Simply put, Nerdanel had healthy parents in a healthy relationship, and Feanor did not. Feanor didn't start out as mad or evil, but he was definitely born with a massive chip on his shoulder because Miriel died giving birth to him. Finwë never recovered from this, even after remarrying, and Feanor had to live with that. And I could easily see that this playing into his need to pretty much control everybody, or that anyone who was lower than him or his father be subservient to him as well. And Feanor, moreover, was very loyal to the memory of his mother, and it's no small coincidence that he takes his name from his mother rather than from his father, even though he does love his father, obviously. And that this loyalty does play a part in his issues with his stepfamily as well. Nerdanel does not have this baggage. If anything, from what little I've read on Mahatan, who was Nerdanel's father, they seem to have a very loving and communicative relationship. Whereas Finwë, though understandably, seems to either have been subservient to Feanor on some level, or just pretty much allowed him to do what he wanted, without ever chastising him or correcting him at any point. Therefore, Nerdanel was in an optimum place to learn patience better, and be taught from a Vala, a race, again, who Feanor always seems to be at odds with. Their vastly different parentage played a huge role in the couple's individual lives and perspectives. And it was that negative perspective of Feanor that Melkor played on when he corrupted him. He wouldn't have gotten nearly as far with Nerdanel, since she was just as extremely perceptive as her husband, whom also eventually saw through the Vala's deception, though he was already pretty much estranged and pretty much on his path to rebellion by this point. Like I said before, no one could control Feanor, and by this time, that included Nerdanel as well. Feanor already had issues, and it was just a matter of lighting the fire at this point, or rather, pouring nitro on it that was already existed. Melkor's lies and influence brought an imbalance to Nerdanel's perfect marriage, yet, for a time, she could still live with it. The more Feanor's insecurities consumed him, though, the more difficult he became to control, until finally it surpassed even Nerdanel's influence. An ebb and flow, I think, that had been going on for a while. Everything finally capping off with Feanor's infamous threat to his half-brother Fingolfin, and after that, Nerdanel pretty much called it quits and became estranged. Because, I think, up until that point, she still saw him as a good person, just one who was struggling, especially since all the Noldor were going through internal gossip issues anyway, thanks to Melkor. Not even Fingolfin was immune to the ego plays that Melkor was saying. However, threatening to kill someone in a land that had never seen deliberate murder was the red line, and I think that Nerdanel was both wise enough and heartbroken enough to realize that the dream was over and that the Feanor that she had fell in love with and had all those adventures across Aman with was gone, consumed by insecurity, a need for control, and ultimately madness and rage. And I hate harping on this all the time, but I always feel it important to mention whenever I talk about Feanor that, again, Feanor never wanted to be king while his father was still alive. He loved his father, but at the same time, he still demanded a certain level of loyalty from everyone else but his father, and for a time, Nerdanel. That Nerdanel stood up to him at all and said no when she finally laid the boundary, allowed Feanor to go into exile with the rest of her family by themselves, and went to her mother-in-law's to stay with during this time. Again, the in-laws and step-family being people who Feanor did not acknowledge as true Noldor, and probably half-breeds as well, since Endis was a Vanyar and not a Noldor, like his mother. The final nail was in the coffin, and the marriage was, for all intents and purposes, done. Unfortunately, it doesn't end there, as we all know. Nerdanel's nightmare continued after Finwë's murder and her estranged husband's rise to the high kingship of the Noldor and the rebellion he led against the Valar, whom he blamed for his father's death, along with Morgoth. And I imagine her getting caught up in the confusion of the times with the death of the trees and the light going out from the rest of Valinor, and as I said already, the death of the High King of the Noldor, Finwë, and she's watching now as someone else is in the shell of her estranged husband, full of rage, vengeance, and just on a total warpath and refusing to take counsel from anybody. Never mind that anyone who lived in Valinor had never seen such strife and amount of hostility ever, at least among the elves who lived there. But now she knows for sure that there was no going back, if indeed she had any hope of trying to regain that anyways. However, there was still the issue of their shared children, and anyone who's been through a divorce and a divorce that has children involved knows kind of where this is going. Because the kids too, the 7 sons of Feanor, were also caught up in this turmoil that was affecting all of Valinor. Nerdanel's loyalty to her children was just as strong as it ever was, even though her love for Feanor had tragically pretty much ended. According to the writing The Legend of the Fate of Amrod, she had received a warning from her father, who had also been warned by the Valar Aule, that any of her family that goes over to Beleriand on the rebellion is not coming back. Therefore, for the sake of her children, or at least 1 or 2 of them, she sees Feanor for one last time, basically asking or pleading that one of them remain so that this prophecy does not come to pass. However, Feanor is too far gone by this point and is already in the midst of making plans for war and leaving Valinor, so he basically shuts her down, accuses her of betraying both him, his family, and the Noldor overall by basically sucking up to the Valar, and that's pretty much it at that point. Though it is also worth noting that in a way the prophecy didn't entirely come true, because Maglor actually did survive the first stage, and just no one knows what happened to him. But he ain't dead, so there you are. It's this extreme fall from grace for Nerdanel's outlook on life that makes her so compelling. She was no weak woman by any means, and fought for what she had and what Feanor had. She never made excuses for him, but tried to work with Feanor's positive traits and rein in his fire that was trying to get out of control. Perhaps even she may have agreed with him on many levels, but thanks to Melkor's machinations, it proved to be too much. Once Feanor's flaws were enhanced and inflamed by the Valar, there was no stopping him. I would like to think, though, that maybe she saw her sons, or at least some of them, again in Valinor after they had died, since Finrod Felagund also died in Middle-earth, but the Silmarillion says that he walks under the trees with his father, Finarfin. I don't see why the same wouldn't apply to the sons, or at least some of them, now that they're dead. And yeah, I get that sounds weird, but there you are. It's a hope I have. And like I said, maybe she heard somehow that Maglor was still alive, wandering around the coast of Middle-earth. So, at least some light in a tragic story. But that's the outlook of Nerdanel. Someone who'd had it all, but knew when she had lost it all, and was able to leave and not get sucked in the loss herself. But what do you think of her story? Do you think she was underplayed too much? Do you think Nerdanel actually had that much control over Feanor, or that she could have stopped him? Let me know in the comments below. And this is the Miller Philosopher, and you guys have a good day.